Welcome everybody on YouTube to another late night speedrun. Let's jump in. I'm Geka from Ukraine. Good luck. We have the black pieces, and we're facing one knight f3, to which, of course, our response is knight f6, and another King's Indian is what we're facing. Okay, so c3, in and of itself, it's hard to comment on this move because this move has no independent value. It's the gateway to either the London system if white plays bishop f4 on the next move, or the Torre attack, or white can play g3 and transition back into kind of a fianchetto setup. So our response is bishop g7, and we kind of wait for white to put their cards on the table, bishop g5, and this is called the Torre attack. It's essentially a London system, the only difference being that the bishop is on g5 rather than on f4. And as it turns out, this seemingly insignificant difference in development completely alters the character of the game. The bishop being on g5 means that essentially playing this as if it were the London system is completely innocuous. And so typically, after we castle, high-rated players who play the Torre system, they end up going knight b to d2, and then either they try to push e4 in one fell swoop, or they play e3, but essentially, like, the ideas for both colors are very different in the Torre versus the London. So you shouldn't think of this as a version of the London or, oh, this is essentially the London. It's actually a completely different opening. And from the black side, you have to arm yourself with a separate set of ideas against these two openings. Of course, they're related. There are similarities, but keep those two separate in your mind. So there's a lot of ways that we could play against this setup. But let's try to kind of keep the King's Indian spirit. And let's start by pushing d6. So we've carried out all of the standard King's Indian moves, and now h4, which is, as you can imagine, not a move that was on my radar, not a move that I think I've ever faced. But it definitely looks scary if you don't know how to deal with this type of early kingside onslaught. And basically, there are three options anytime you face the move h4. Option one is to ignore and to allow your opponent to push the pawn to h5. Option two is to push h5 ourselves and kind of freeze the king side. Option three, and this is the option that a lot of people kind of forget about, is to push the pawn one square. So this is what we're going to do in this game. We're going to go h6, and we're going to encourage white to give us the bishop pair and then push h5, which is exactly what white does. Of course, the idea of the move h6 is that now we can push g5, and still the king side is essentially frozen. Now, what is the drawback of what we just did? So we pushed h6, we encouraged the trade, and then h5, g5. What can come back to potentially bite us in the butt? Who can explain this conceptually so that we know what to look for? Yeah, so the light squares, but in particular, we have to be very careful about like the h7 square. We have to be absolutely sure that we're not allowing in the future our opponent to build a battery on this diagonal, because queen h7 is not a threat that is to be taken lightly. Having said that, our opponent starts with nb to d2, and here again, I think that we have kind of a wide variety of different ways that we can handle this position. But one very interesting move that's probably not on your radar at all, you're probably not thinking about this move, but I'm going to play it, and it's actually to push d5. So one of the themes thus far in my King's Indian speedrun games has been flexibility. Just because you're a King's Indian player doesn't mean that your top priority is to the current position on the board, and it doesn't matter what your opening repertoire is. You should be able to play the move that you think you should play. So it's not like we're now playing a Grunfeld. The reason I push d5 is because I want to restrict this knight. I want to prevent it from jumping to e4, and later on, I want to continue expanding on the king side by carrying out this e7, e5 pawn break. Okay, so knight h2. Clearly, our opponent is going to g4. Queen to d7 would be a very awkward move. So knight g4 itself is not scary. It's just annoying because it hits these two pieces. So let's bring the bishop back to g7. Pretty simple prophylaxis. And now let's start attacking white's center. As you already know, there are two principal ways in which we can do that. There is e5, but pushing e5 here wouldn't make much sense. Because then white could take on e5, and we just moved this bishop back. we'd have to make another move with the bishop, and then the knight would jump to g4, and then we'd have to make another move with the bishop. So let's go for the other break, c5. White castles queenside. Our opponent is intent on checkmating us, but he's castling right into like a massive attack. I mean, the queenside is never a safe place for White's king to be, but knowing how to actually punish this type of move is very important. And it's hard. Like, you're looking at this position, you're like, let's go queen a5, b5. A lot of you are probably pining for, some sacrifice, but a little bit of patience goes a really long way when you're trying to punish this kind of play. So what do I see here? Well, what I'm noticing is that a move like queen a5 looks good on the surface, but the white king is able to evacuate to b1 and potentially to a1. Let's start by simply developing our pieces, bishop f5, fixing the king on c1. It's much harder to shoot at a moving target, and by fixing the king, we're making sure that it doesn't evacuate to essentially to a1. Now, queen a5 is much more effective because White has to make a further weakness in order to protect the pawn. But we don't even need queen a5. We can also just continue our development with knight c6 and potentially set up a sacrifice on the d4 square. But yeah, it's basically a matter of taste. Let's go queen a5. I kind of promised this move. And mate is incoming very, very soon. So first of all, queen takes a2 is the immediate threat. Now we're going to play c takes d4. Why are we doing that? Now, a lot of you are like, let's go bishop takes d4. That's actually a blunder. And you should pause the video here and try to figure out why. Again, patience is kind of the crucial element of most successful attacks. So let's just set everything up by bringing the rook to c8. What is it that we're setting up? Where we're already threatening rook takes c3. That's already a huge threat, which leads to pretty quick checkmate. And just a moment here. I'm just trying to figure out, does rook takes c3 lead to mate? So rook c3, bc, queen c3, king to d1. And who can spot the mating pattern after king d1? This is actually really important. So we play rook takes c3, bc, queen takes c3, king to d1. And then we give the check on c2, but not with a queen, but with the bishop, forcing the king to e2, and then queen to d3 is mate. This sacrifice works. Now, what if white doesn't take it? Well, we'll cross that bridge if we get there, but we're not going to get there because our opponent is going into this. Okay, so the game is over. Bishop to c2 is the key move. If king c1, we, of course, play bishop d3 and queen c2. And this is a really classic pattern that you should be fully aware of. Yeah, now queen d3 is mate. Beautiful. Okay. Yeah, a lot to unpack there because we've never faced the Torre attack before, and we'll probably face it again. But that wasn't the main part of the game. So c3, again, bishop g7. If white plays bishop f4, we have a London system. A lot of things that white can do. Our opponent decided on the Torre attack. So we start by castling. And again, you have to remember that, if you're 1100, 1200, and you're grinding like chessable, you're going to face a lot of moves that are not in, whatever course you're learning, because people aren't really playing the main line. The main line in this position is knight b to d2, essentially preparing e4. And again, lots of things that black can do, but the point is you can go d6, and it turns out that e4 is actually not very scary in these positions for many reasons. But I really like going h6 in this position, just kind of asking this bishop where it's going to go. And most people kind of automatically drop back to h4. One interesting idea just to put into your toolkit, if white plays bishop takes f6, how would you recapture? How would you recapture? Now, the fact that I'm asking this question is already a hint. So oftentimes in this specific structure, ef6 is very strong. And the point is, of course, you want to push f5. Like if white plays bishop e2, which is a very cooperative move, after f5, you reopen the diagonal and you chip away at white's center. Black is doing great. Now, of course, the experienced Torre player will put the bishop on d3, but even here, black is actually completely fine. Like the computer proposes knight c6 or c5. I like this idea, knight c6. There's two games in the database here, castles kingside, and now knight back to e7 in order to prepare f5. And the position is approximately equal. There's one game from 1954 where white went rook e1 and black played f5, but the computer likes c6, just controlling some squares, and f5 is coming next. Black is completely fine. So just something to remember. Bishop h4 is much more common because white typically doesn't want to give up the bishop pair. And here you want to remember that c5 is typically much better in the Torre system than e5. You can orient your play toward like on the e5 break, but it's hard to get this move through with the white bishop pinning the knight. Like if you play e5 immediately, well, that's just a blunder. There's no way to win the pawn back. And if you try to prepare e5 with knight b to d7, it gets kind of annoying. Like I looked at these types of positions. This pin is annoying. Black is a little bit cramped. c5 is a much better move. And if white plays d5, then after e6, you immediately get rid of this pawn and get very free play. A lot of people at a lower level, they'll play like c4, but after rook e8, white's position collapses because white's king is stuck in the center, and you're threatening g5 and e takes d5. So in this position, there's a lot of theory. This is like the starting point, and I won't bore you too much, but what you should kind of remember for now is that if white plays knight b to d2 and e4, you want to throw an h6, and then you want to push c5, and you're not afraid of d5. You're not afraid of dc, which is the main line. Typically, white plays bishop c4, black plays knight c6, and this position is completely innocuous. Here you have this very powerful move, knight h5, and now the bishop on h4 is like, where on earth do I go? The computer actually thinks black is slightly better after rook e1, queen to c7, to prevent e5. Very important. e5 is a nasty idea. You want to make sure that you're controlling this square. So if white plays queen e2, now knight to a5 is really nice, hitting the other bishop. And if white insists on e5, well, then having eliminated the light square bishop, white's entire play lacks any kind of sense. You have the bishop pair, you have great development, and the knight on h5 is really nicely placed to restrict this bishop and can jump into f4 at the right moment. So that's a little bit of an overview. Of course, our opponent plays the less ambitious move, which is e3. Nothing wrong with e3, but it's unambitious. We proceed with d6 and h4, already a novelty. I'm not seeing a single game in my database with this move. And we decided to respond with h6, kind of immediately forcing white's hand. Bishop f4 wouldn't make much sense here. And here we can just proceed with our development. We can go knight c6 and prepare e5 with tempo. And again, anytime white pushes h5 in this type of position, you can play knight takes h5. Nothing is going to happen just because your opponent sacrifices twice on h5. But remember that you also have this move g5. So h6 is a really nice way to slow down your opponent's kingside attack. So bishop f6, h5, g5, and here we just have a great position. So next important moment, knight b to d2, d5 restricting the e4 square. Knight h2 is kind of a bad move. If I were white, I would play bishop d3 here, and we would probably still respond with c5, and black basically has very free development. But the one thing I wanted to point out after c5, obviously after castle's queenside bishop f5, I think white is essentially lost. First of all, we have a question. After d5, was e4 a good move? I think it was a decent move, but here we can counter-strike in the center with c5. And if white plays dc, we can actually push g4. And here we have a really, really strong attack. Basically, black has a big lead in development. White's stuck in mud, and it's not clear where white's going to put their king. So c5 should be kind of instinctual in these positions for you. You should never be afraid that you're giving up a pawn. If white plays e5, you get kind of a French structure on steroids, because white is not going to be able to hold their center, because you can always go g4 at the right moment, and you can play sort of the typical French moves, knight c6 and queen b6, and white simply falls apart. At some point, white's going to have to go here, and then you could pick up the e5 pawn with interest. If white ever castles short, then the h5 pawn is going to be really weak. You can pick it up like this. So Yeah, so you just can't combine the Torre attack with like an early H pawn advance. It doesn't make sense. But what I wanted to say is like, what is our response to DC? How do you respond when your opponent just like takes this pawn? There's many things that you can do, but the takeaway is that you don't need to like rush to win this pawn back. If you're winning the pawn back while developing, that's great. So the move knight d7 here is excellent, just attacking the pawn and developing a knight. b4 blunders c3. Typically, white tries to hold the pawn by going knight b3, and now you reinforce the attack with queen c7. And if white just like stubbornly clings onto the pawn, then you can go a6, and the queen just has nowhere to go. I guess queen b4, but now you can go rook to d8, a5, e5. White's position is no good. So don't rush to win this pawn back, but if you can do it while maintaining coordination, then you should. And then very important, bishop f5, patient move. We're not afraid of e4. I mean, that just opens the center for us. We're not afraid of g4. The bishop has the whole diagonal. And then once the queen comes in, the game is essentially over. Open up the c file and one more bit of patience. Still not too late to screw everything up. Bishop takes d4. Why is this move wrong? Circling back to my first question, why can't we just crack open the c file and go for mate like this? It's because of a very specific counter resource, knight to b3, and suddenly the tables turn. The queen is hit, the bishop is hit, white picks up the bishop with a knight, and white is up a piece. So anytime your queen enters the attack, you have to remember that the queen is also a liability. All right, so when your queen is in your opponent's territory, oftentimes it's easy to relax and actually forget about a fork of this kind. So for example, just before the speedrun, I was playing a bunch of blitz, and I missed this exact type of tactic. Let me just find this game really quickly. So I had this position, I had the black pieces. This was just earlier tonight. And I'm basically checkmating the white king. And here I decide, let's force the rook trade with rook to d1. But because my queen is a direct participant in the attack, it's susceptible to forks. And I blundered this really, really instructive knight fork. Turns out that there are no checks. I still won the game, but I should have lost. So watch out for these random knight forks while you're attacking. This is another good example. So that's why we started with rook c8. Essentially, white is just collapsing. And now simple calculation. If white doesn't take the rook, you can just drop back. Or queen a4. There's probably forced mate here. Even bishop c2. Yeah, bishop c2 is just forced mate. And yeah, this is a pretty mate. Let's get one more game in. And let's get a 5-minute game in. Let's alternate. 5-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute. We have white against a 1600. And let's get the show on the road in Alapin. Knight f65. Knight d5, knight f3. So remember, we don't rush the move d4. This is kind of the modern way to play the Alapin. Now, g6 is not a great move. It's not a huge mistake. But if you know how to punish it, black is immediately in trouble. So the way to punish g6 is now you play d4. So you're like, okay. Typically, black takes on d4. And if you're kind of new to the Alapin, one important aspect is you should never like just automatically recapture on d4 with a pawn. Sometimes you can take on d4 with the queen. And maybe some of you are tempted by the prospect of like pushing e6, which is usually a lot less dangerous than it looks. But the point is you don't have to touch this pawn at all. And instead, you put the accent on rapid development. You're essentially playing a version of the Smith-Morra gambit where you sack the center pawn in order to get really quick development. Okay, bishop g7. And then at some point, if black leaves the pawn on d4, well, at some point, you're going to have to recapture it. But first, you can kind of harass black on the king side. So here, we have a move that may look very superficial, but because black's development is so poor, and because we already have this bishop here, and we have a queen that can come out to f3, it's a very nasty move to face, and I'm talking about knight g5. Simply hitting f7, and now we bring another piece into the attack, queen f3. Suddenly, this pawn is under fire again, and if black is forced to play e6, then that's essentially a positional victory for us. Why is it a positional victory for us? Well, some of you might remember that in earlier speedruns, I made a big accent on not combining the moves e6 and g6 in the Sicilian. And the reason why is that these dark squares are horribly weakened. Now, there's a lot of concrete considerations here. Black will have some development, will have to react accurately, but by and large, the game should eventually be decided by the fact that these squares are very weak, and this knight on g5 is a very powerful attacker. Now let's shift the queen to h3 and threaten checkmate, vacating the f3 square for the knight so that the d4 pawn can be protected. Bishop e3 is what a lot of people would play. That's actually a blunder. Notice how I'm combining defense and attack. The knight retreats, but suddenly there's another threat on the h6 pawn, inducing more weaknesses and forcing black to waste another tempo. So basically, black is deciding between h5, g5, maybe king h7, but that's very flimsy indeed. Black is in mortal danger. Now, depending on how black chooses to defend this pawn, we can either try to quickly develop the rest of our pieces, like go knight c3, maybe even castle kingside, or we can play for checkmate, which is the riskier option, but could potentially end the game sooner. So here, for instance, we can go knight c3 and just pass the turn to our opponent. Nothing wrong with that. But the moment g5 is played, and you should kind of borrow this from the previous game, you should realize that this diagonal is horribly weakened. And so some of you might be tempted to sacrifice immediately, go like bishop g5, hg, and then bishop back to c2. Unfortunately, that is unsound, and black can pretty easily parry the threat of queen h7. So some patience is needed. We can start with bishop c2, or we can exploit the weakness created by our opponent's previous move and thrust the queen forward to h5. This is the move that I'm very partial to, because it keeps the queen heavily involved in the attack. It sets up the threat of bishop takes g5, which is now a much more serious possibility. And it also, apart from everything else, creates the possibility of h4, using the g5 pawn as a hook. So it's a move that contains many ideas. f6, good defensive instincts by our opponent, but that shouldn't prevent us from accomplishing our aims on the king side. Let's go h4. And let's just try to tear open the king side. Now, queen e8, I was expecting this move. And one very important rule is that you should never just like rule out a queen trade when you're attacking. Like sometimes the attack has many stages. At first, you're going for checkmate. Your opponent finds a few good defensive moves. Okay, let's get this into an endgame where we're better because we're still attacking. You can deliver checkmate without a queen. Trust me. So here we go ef6. We open up as much territory on the king side as we can, and the attack simply continues without our queen. Now, it's important that we don't rush bishop takes g5, because then after the trade, black picks up the pawn in the center. We're not worried about losing this pawn, right? So you should not play bishop e3 here. But I'm sensing that we just don't have enough fuel to light the fire on the king side. So my intuition tells me let's develop some more pieces. Let's try to get this knight into the attack. And by the way, knight e4 is not the only path that the knight could take. Knight b5 is also something to consider, depending on what black does. So this is what it means to keep up the pressure. You hear this phrase often. To keep up the pressure means to keep creating problems for your opponent, and eventually they're going to crack. Now, because we brought this knight out to c3, and because black has played the move d5, I think now is a good time for bishop takes g5. And there's a very specific reason for that, which is that now after knight takes d4, we could get our other rook into the attack really, really quickly by castling queenside. And now I simply want to lift this rook to d3 and then to g3, and we're back to playing for checkmate. Now notice how our opponent is just not fast enough, right? Their queenside is not developed, so eventually he's going to crack. It's just a matter of time. Let's get the tower into the game and try to get it to h3. We can also secure the knight with f4 if necessary. And if black plays e5, the reason I'm sort of keeping this rook on d3 is because I'm also preventing our opponent from breaking free with e5, which probably he's going to do anyway, but it doesn't work tactically because of knight takes d5. Now the knight enters the attack, and after the trade on d5, we're threatening mate in 1, and we're attacking the e5 pawn. And finally, we can kind of cash in our chips. Yeah, kudos to our opponent. They defended really well, but finally black cracks, knight to d7. Many ways to win here, but I think the most congruent move is rook h3 because we complete the attack by threatening mate. Black is just going to be forced to give up all of the pieces. Rook, king f8. Many ways, many roads lead to Rome, but you should try to choose the simplest option. If you see a fork, if you see a way to win decisive material, you should do it. You shouldn't lose on time trying to find, the most precise engine way to win. Doesn't matter. A point is a point. And now we have checkmate in 2 moves. You should pause the video and try to find it. White to play and mate in 2. Yeah, knight to e7 is the starting move to cover the f5 square. And then rook h6 is the follow-up mate. Beautiful. All right. So the pace is a little bit more frantic toward the end. I apologize for that. But still, I think there was a lot there to talk about. Yeah, so we've obviously played the Alapin bunch in the speedrun. And we faced various moves in this position. The most popular is knight c6, to which we respond bishop c4. There's also d6. Here, I've recommended giving a check on b5. There's also e6, and after d4, typically black trades, and then either goes d6 or b6. So there's a lot of lines to know. g6 is more of a sideline, and I might have confused the line a little bit. So I'm actually going to check this right now with an engine to make sure that I punish this correctly. Yeah, actually, the way that I played is a little bit sketchy. Bishop c4 or d4 is actually fine. d4 is good. C takes d4. So this is correct. Bishop c4, knight back to b6, bishop back to b3. And one important thing to understand is what you would do in response to dc. Like, what if black just greedily grabs the pawn? Now, you still go knight g5. And the point is that black can never really intercept you because of the en passant. That doesn't do anything. And as soon as black plays e6, that's a great sign for you. Now there's an easy way to exploit these 2 squares, and that's just by dropping the knight back to e4. And if black covers the 2 squares, then you can just go knight b takes e3, and you just have a completely dominant position. Castles, you can just castle. Like, you don't have to do anything special. As long as this e5 pawn is well secured, black is totally paralyzed. And the moment black tries to break free, well, black just creates more weaknesses for themselves. And even though the pawn on e5 is gone, now there's a bishop that's taken its place. And it should kind of make sense to you if you're 1600 why black is essentially lost here, because the queen side is just not playing. And the knight is coming in. It's a good position for you to analyze, right? Like, if you're sitting here and you're like, well, I can see what you're saying, but I don't know why white is winning. Don't be lazy. Put up the position on chess.com. Spend 10 minutes analyzing with an engine, and you're going to understand a lot more about this is like how you learn structures, right? I can't teach you everything. So that's the way you punish DC. Our opponent played a wiser move, emphasizing development. And actually, knight g5, according to the computer, is not accurate. White keeps the advantage simply by recapturing on d4 cd. Black typically castles. And here the computer really likes this move a4, which is very thematic. Very, very thematic. And in general, this is an idea that you should be aware of anytime there's a knight on b6 or on g6. Running the pawn up to a5 can be incredibly powerful. Like, actually, here it traps the knight. Literally, the knight is trapped. And if black plays a5, then of course there's an outpost that the knight now has on b5. So you can go knight c3. Black will try to open up the center with d6. And here you can just complete your development with bishop e3. And notice how you're reaping the benefits of these 2 moves. If black now plays de, then you can play de, and the knight is suddenly hanging. So apart from the b5 square, the actual knight on b6 is looser. And you're threatening to win a piece by trading queens and picking up the knight. So a4 is a really, really nice move. It has been played a couple of times. One game black played d6, but now you push a5, and then you push e6. And black is in huge trouble. That's actually what happened in the game. Takes, knight g5. Ugh. This is a disaster for black. Bishop takes c6 check. You can't take back because of the fork. King h8, and just castle keeping the tension. White is essentially winning. Also, you have this rook lift, rook a3, rook h3 that the move a4 enables. So notice how much benefit you reap just from this one idea, a4. There's a lot of good examples in chess literature of this idea working to perfection. I'm just going to show you one of them. Obviously, no better way to learn than to look at Botvinnik games. Now, this is colors reversed. So remember, the ideas that I show are equally applicable with either color. And it's black to play. And the question is, how should black kind of undo the Gordian's knot on the king side? Botvinnik wins this game in 5 more moves. And the position looks like nothing special. How can you win this in 5 moves? So the first step is to root out the bishop on h6. But you don't want to do it with bishop g7 because you don't want to give up your king's Indian bishop. So Botvinnik drops the knight back to f7. White says, okay, I'm going to move my bishop back to e3. But what idea is now available? Well, you should notice the knight on g3. Botvinnik continues the pressure with h5. And watch how this works to perfection. White plays bishop f1, h4, forcing the knight away from g3. Botvinnik immediately seizes all of these key dark squares and clamps down even further. And immediately white blunders. White tries to break free with knight f4. This loses the game by force. Pause the video, see if you can figure this out. How does black win the game? And it's actually not that easy to figure this out. I've given this position to a lot of people, and they almost always say the same wrong move because it's very tempting, but it doesn't actually work. So what is the accurate method here? So it's not rook takes e3, which is what everybody says, because queen takes e3, and what have you achieved? Bishop d4, rook takes d4. Obviously, that's the idea. Cd, queen d4. White is just up a pawn. The correct idea has nothing to do with the sack on e3, which is what makes it hard. Yeah, Henning got it. So it's actually knight takes f4. Now a check on d4. That's why we didn't give that bishop away. And suddenly after g5, white resigned. The bishop is trapped. h4 covers g3. And as always, world champions seem to always have their pieces on the right square. So this is just one example of many where this idea works to perfection. So back to the speedrun game, this idea you can put in your pocket. Instead, I played knight g5, which is actually not the best move. So I mixed up my own preparation a little bit here. Our opponent castled, queen f3. And actually here, black is better, but only if he finds a really advanced idea. So after e6, which is what our opponent played, queen h3 immediately, or c takes d4, white is much better. But black actually can seize the advantage here with the move d5. And this is ridiculously hard to understand. After e takes d6 on Passant, the correct move is e takes d6. For what it's worth, this position has occurred twice in the database, and both times black played the human move, which is e6. And here the position remains very, very complicated. White can play queen g3, keeping the d6 pawn. It's double-edged. ed gives black the advantage. Why does nobody play it? Well, nobody wants to allow this move, but suddenly there's a check on e7, and it turns out that this knight is a sitting duck. You can step away with check, but now everything is hanging, and against any other move, black is just going to pick up the knight on f7. So that is the reason why my move knight g5 was premature. It was because of d5. And also after d5, if white plays c takes d4, now after knight c6, there's no queen h3. So it's really, really awkward. White has to play like here. Black can play f6, and now the knight doesn't have any good squares. So this is getting really, really scary for white. Like the knight has to drop back. Black goes g5, g4. White is worse. So a good cautionary tale. But after our opponent played e6 and we were able to recapture, white is chilling. But the one big thing here is not to play bishop to e3 because of knight takes d4, and suddenly the bishop is overloaded and our center collapses. So this queen h3, knight f3 idea, really, really important. And then the attack begins. We start with queen h5. Why couldn't we have taken and gone bishop c2? Well, because black can just slide the rook away. And I've talked about this before. This is a very common dead end where you've given the check, congrats, but the bishop, the fianchettoed bishop, maintains control over the key squares. So don't get too excited. Same problem with bishop c2. It's a slow move. Our opponent can go f5 or even rook e8, and you're at a bit of a dead end. That's why we played queen h5. f6, and ignore h4. Obviously, you don't want to take on f6 because this just helps your opponent activate their pieces. Instead, you want to meet fire with fire. And then, sure, let's trade queens. Let's open up the king side. And then at the right moment, this is like the big takeaway from the speedrun today, you want to make the patient move at the right moment. Right? So a lot of people would just like continue capturing stuff. This position is very unconvincing because the rook can't get into the attack. But after we develop one set of pieces, now the situation changes. We have long castle, and this rook very quickly gets into the attack. And black can never play e5 because the d5 pawn is a serious weakness. And that's basically what happened. Rook to d3, rook g7, f4. Rook h3 is unstoppable. Our opponent tried to stop it, but now he falls apart in the center. And the game ends right around here. I don't think black really had a defense once we got into the endgame. I'm just double checking. Yeah, according to the computer, black had to play. Actually, according to the computer, after bishop d7, black is surviving. Because after rook dh3, you can just run with the king. And to be honest, I forgot that the rook on a8 is protected. So if you give a check, then the king is able to escape into the center. But here, white is still much better because this knight can be rerouted to d4. And the e6 pawn is a weakness. So the attack continues. Like, black doesn't solve all of his problems. But our opponent panicked, which is just a matter of time. And we won the game pretty easily. And that's that. All right, guys, very, very late. I would go longer, but I'm really tired and I want to get some sleep before Bullet Brawl tomorrow. Sorry, the last 2 episodes have been a little bit shorter, but I hope it's been worth your while to listen. Thanks, everybody, for watching and hanging out. It's been a long stream. All right, guys, see you later.